I want you to picture a country facing what is basically an impossible economic paradox.
Right.
Imagine a nation where the old age dependency ratio hasn't just, crept up.
Right.
It has absolutely skyrocketed.
Yeah, a massive spike.
We are talking about a demographic crisis, getting old before getting rich,
Yeah.
basically, that normally just completely stalls developing economies.
Oh, it's the exact scenario that gives central bankers cold sweats.
Exactly. But in this specific country, they haven't stagnated at all. Instead, their gross national income per capita has just exploded past $28,000. And that's adjusted for purchasing power.
Which is wild.
It is wild. And beyond that, they've virtually eradicated their reliance on fossil fuels for electricity.
Completely wiped it out.
Yeah, and they boast these human development metrics that rival the wealthiest nations on Earth.
You know, when you lay the data out like that, it honestly sounds like you're describing some highly engineered, heavily subsidized Nordic utopia.
Right. That is exactly the assumption most people make. But we are not talking about Scandinavia.
No, we are not.
We are looking at the South American nation of Uruguay. And today, you and I are going on a deep dive into the underlying logic of exactly how they pulled this off.
Let's do it.
We are unpacking a really massive stack of structural data today. We've got World Bank economic indicators, International Labor Organization, employment stats, all to decode what we can basically call the Uruguay model.
And it really is a masterclass in what I like to call asymmetric development.
What do you mean by that?
Well, I mean that Uruguay proves that you don't need a massive domestic market. You don't need, like, hundreds of millions of consumers.
Right.
And you certainly don't need to be a global industrial superpower to build an incredibly resilient, future-proof society.
They kind of just carved their own path.
Exactly. They used highly targeted strategies to front-run the green energy transition, weaponize financial inclusion, and completely rewire their social policy. They effectively broke the traditional rules of how a country is supposed to develop.
And to understand how they broke those rules, we first have to, we have to look at the ticking clock they were up against.
Yeah, the demographic ticking clock.
Yeah. We have to look at their baseline data, which paints this picture of a highly developed social fabric that is simultaneously facing a really severe structural threat.
It's a fascinating contradiction.
It really is. Like, if you look at the World Bank indicators, the human development baseline is phenomenal. Their life expectancy has steadily climbed well past 77 years.
Which is fantastic.
And their literacy rates sit at a staggering 99%.
Yeah, practically everyone.
Right. And their net enrollment rate in primary school is also practically universal, hovering right around that 99% mark.
So those are the foundational characteristics of a first world nation's human capital. They have an educated, long-living populace. But yeah, the flip side of that success is found in the demographic data. And this is where the alarm bells historically started ringing for their policymakers.
Because of the aging.
Exactly. If you track the data series for population dependency, specifically looking at the shifts in the age structure over the last few decades, it reveals a rapidly accelerating aging problem.
Yeah. I've been looking really closely at the historical crossover in this data. It spans from like 1960 all the way to 2023.
And what does it show?
It tracks two competing metrics. You have the youth dependency burden and the old age dependency burden.
Right.
Back in the 1960s, Uruguay had this massive youth dependency, around 42.9% of the population.
Lots of kids.
Lots of kids. But as the decades roll on, that youth burden plummets down to 21.3%.
Cut in half.
Exactly. Meanwhile, the old age dependency marches just relentlessly upward, from about 12.7% in the 60s to a staggering 24.4% today.
Yeah, and that 24.4% figure is the crux of the entire paradox here.
How so?
Well, to put that in perspective, that is far higher than the vast majority of developing nations, and it places this immense, really heavy structural burden on the working age population.
I always think about this in terms of like corporate structure.
Oh, that's a good way to look at it.
Right. Imagine a company trying to aggressively scale its operations and compete globally. But suddenly, a massive chunk of their most experienced staff transitions into retirement. They're drawing from the company pension.
And they aren't producing anymore.
Exactly. And the HR department simply isn't hiring enough young people to replace them.
Because the birth rate dropped.
Yeah. So the workers who are left certainly have to generate significantly more output just to maintain the status quo, let alone actually grow the company. You have fewer people doing the heavy lifting to support an increasingly heavy structural burden.
That is the exact dynamic, just scaled up to a sovereign level. And historically, that dynamic is the primary ingredient for what economists call the middle income trap.
Getting stuck.
Getting entirely stuck, yeah. The classic playbook for a developing nation to become wealthy relies heavily on a demographic dividend.
You need a lot of young workers.
You do. You have a massive, rapidly expanding, incredibly young labor force. You leverage that cheap manpower to manufacture goods. You export those goods to wealthier nations. You industrialize rapidly.
And your economy grows much faster than your population ages.
Exactly. You essentially brute force your way to wealth through sheer demographic volume.
Like the Asian tigers in the late 20th century.
Right. Or China in the 1990s and 2000s.
But Uruguay did not have that demographic luxury.
They absolutely didn't. Their birth rates were dropping steadily, and their citizens were living much longer. They were staring down a fundamental reversal in the structural burden on their labor force.
They were running out of new workers long before they had accumulated enough national wealth to comfortably support, what, a quarter of their population in retirement?
Precisely. Which means they couldn't rely on cheap labor. They had to figure out how to generate significantly more economic output and much higher value output with significantly fewer people.
And that brings us to their first major structural pivot.
The health dividend.
Right. When your population is aging and your birth rate is dropping, the absolute most critical thing a government can do is protect the human capital that it actually does have, right from day one.
It is the bedrock of everything that follows in their economic model. I mean, you cannot build a high-value service economy if you are constantly losing your future workforce to preventable causes.
Yeah, and there's a very specific piece of data in the World Bank data set that tracks this perfectly. It's the infant mortality rate.
And the drop is wild.
It's unbelievable. Back in the 1960s, infant mortality in Uruguay was staggeringly high. We were talking about 56.6 deaths per 1,000 live births.
That is a heartbreaking level of systemic loss.
It really is. But as you track the data into the modern era, you see this absolute cliff drop. That number glides all the way down to 5.5 per 1,000 by 2023.
Which is incredible. Achieving 5.5 per thousand completely rivals the most advanced high-income economies in the world. It is a monumental public health achievement.
It is, but I want to push on this a bit with you.
Sure.
Because, as a humanist, obviously saving infants is the highest possible moral good a society can strive for. But from a cold, hard, purely macroeconomic perspective, how does improving infant mortality actually move the needle on a national GDP?
That's a very fair question.
I think most people assume economic growth comes from, discovering an oil reserve or opening up a massive new trade route or deregulating an industry.
Yeah.
How does saving infants fundamentally restructure an economy?
It requires us to look at the math of human capital in a severely constrained environment.
Okay.
You have to remember the scale of Uruguay. This is a small country. Their total population is just over 3 million people.
Really small.
Right. When your birth rate is low and your total population is that small,
Yeah.
you simply cannot afford any attrition in your future labor pool. Every single life lost is not just a moral tragedy. It is a 100% loss of decades of future economic potential.
Decades of innovation, consumer spending, and tax revenue.
Tax revenue required to sustain the state, exactly. But it goes much deeper than just the future labor of that one individual. High infant mortality deeply impacts the psychology and the economic behavior of the entire family unit.
Oh, how so?
Think about household capital allocation. When infant mortality is high, families historically have more children. It acts as a tragically necessary biological insurance policy.
Because they assume some won't make it.
Exactly. But having 5 or 6 children strains household resources to the breaking point. It dilutes the amount of money a family can spend on food, housing, and most importantly, education for each individual child.
That makes a lot of sense.
Furthermore, it keeps women out of the formal workforce for a much longer period because they are locked into continuous early childcare.
So it basically traps the family in a cycle of bare minimum survival.
Yes, but when a state intervenes and drops infant mortality to 5.5 per thousand, it changes the behavioral economics of the entire society.
Because they trust the system.
Right. When parents trust that their children will survive into adulthood, they tend to have fewer children. And when they have fewer children, they concentrate their capital.
It's kind of like a venture capitalist focusing their funds on 2 high-potential startups instead of spreading it thinly across 10.
That is a very apt way to look at it. The family invests heavily in the tertiary education, the healthcare, and the specialized skills of those fewer children.
They're building high-yield human capital.
Exactly. Dropping that mortality rate essentially salvaged Uruguay's diminishing population dividend. It ensured that the next generation, while smaller in absolute numbers, would be vastly more productive and highly skilled.
It basically bought the nation the runway it needed to execute the really big macroeconomic pivots.
And those pivots were massive.
They had to be, because once you have a highly educated, healthy, but relatively small workforce, you need to power the economy they're going to build.
Right, you need energy.
Tons of it.
Right.
To fuel a high-income, highly digitized economy, you need an incredible amount of electricity. But typically, for a small nation without massive domestic oil reserves, importing expensive fossil fuels completely drains your national wealth.
Energy dependency is the Achilles heel of most developing nations. Every time the price of oil spikes, your GDP bleeds out.
Which is why the energy data from Uruguay is frankly mind-blowing. By 2014, renewable sources accounted for an astounding 99.7% of Uruguay's total electricity production.
It's basically unheard of.
They essentially achieved a 100% green grid. But as you pointed out in your analysis of the data, the top-line number doesn't tell the whole story.
No, it doesn't.
The specific composition of that green energy is what makes this a macroeconomic masterstroke, rather than just an environmental talking point.
We really have to look at the historical context to understand the brilliance of their strategy here, because for decades, Uruguay actually had a very high percentage of renewable energy anyway.
Oh, they did?
Yes, but it was almost entirely reliant on hydroelectric power. In some years, hydro accounted for over 90%, sometimes 99% of their entire grid.
Well, on the surface, that sounds perfect. Water is renewable, it's green, it doesn't produce carbon.
It sounds perfect until a massive La Niña weather pattern parks itself over South America and it stops raining for 6 months. The fundamental existential vulnerability of a purely hydroelectric grid is severe drought. When a hydro-dependent country faces a drought, the rivers run low, the reservoirs deplete, the dam turbines stop spinning, and the entire national grid faces collapse.
And you can't just tell hospitals and data centers to turn off their power until it rains.
No, you absolutely cannot. So what happens? The government is forced into the spot market. They have to suddenly import massive emergency shipments of incredibly expensive diesel and heavy fuel oil to run backup thermal power plants just to keep the lights on.
Which completely blows up the national budget.
Completely. It creates an immediate balance of payments crisis, it drains their foreign currency reserves, and the cost of that imported oil gets passed down to businesses and consumers, causing immediate spikes in inflation.
It acts as a massive, unpredictable tax on the entire economy.
Precisely. Uruguay recognized that this vulnerability was incompatible with their goal of becoming a stable, high-income service economy. So if you look at the subset data, specifically the indicator tracking electricity from non-hydroelectric renewable sources,
Right, the wind and solar data.
right, you see one of the most aggressive infrastructure pivots in modern history.
I see it right here in the tracking data.
Yeah.
For decades, the non-hydro renewable baseline is basically flatlining at 0%. Just nothing.
Nothing at all.
But then, starting around the late 2000s and accelerating into the 2010s, wind, solar, and biomass generation absolutely explode.
Yeah.
It soars from basically zero to account for over 51% of their total renewable output by 2021.
They systematically diversified their renewable portfolio. They didn't just stay green. They made their green grid weatherproof.
I think about it like an investor building an all-weather portfolio.
Sure.
Like if you were 100% invested in tech stocks and the tech sector crashes, you are ruined. But if you hold tech, bonds, real estate, and commodities, you can weather the storm.
That's a great comparison.
Uruguay essentially built an all-weather energy portfolio. If you hit a dry patch and the hydro dams are running low, well, the wind off the Atlantic coast is usually still blowing to spin the wind turbines.
Yep.
And if the wind dies down, you burn biomass-like agricultural and forestry waste to generate thermal power. It creates this incredibly resilient interlocking system.
And we really need to emphasize the mechanism of how they achieved this.
The financing.
Yeah, because building a massive network of wind farms requires immense upfront capital. A country of 3 million people doesn't just have billions of dollars lying around in the treasury to buy wind turbines.
Right. So how exactly does a small developing nation finance a total grid overhaul without bankrupting the state or taking on crippling sovereign debt?
They utilized highly structured public-private partnerships, or PPPs, and specific long-term power purchase agreements.
How does that work in practice?
The state-owned utility essentially went to the global private market and said, if you front the capital to build the wind farm, we legally guarantee that we will buy every single kilowatt of electricity you produce at a fixed, stable price for the next 20 years.
Ah, so they de-risk the investment for foreign capital.
Completely. Because Uruguay had a track record of strong institutional stability and respect for the rule of law, foreign investors trusted that the contract would be honored. Global capital flooded in to build the infrastructure, the state didn't have to take on massive debt, and the country got a state-of-the-art wind network.
And by doing so, they essentially built a fortress around their entire macroeconomic structure.
Exactly. Think about the geopolitical landscape. When global oil prices spike because of a supply chain crisis or a conflict in the Middle East, most developing nations experience severe economic shockwaves.
Yeah, everything gets more expensive.
Their currency devalues because they're selling it to buy U.S. dollars to buy oil. Transportation costs soar. Manufacturing and running businesses becomes too expensive. The whole economy shudders.
But Uruguay insulated themselves from that chaos. The wind blowing off their coast doesn't change its price based on global geopolitics. The sun doesn't suddenly charge a premium because of a supply chain issue. By securing sovereign, infinite, predictable power, they created an economic moat. They fixed their long-term energy costs, which is incredibly attractive for businesses trying to plan for the next decade.
But fixing the hardware of the energy grid is really only half the battle.
What's the other half?
Having cheap, infinite green power is useless if your citizens aren't connected to the global economy to actually monetize it.
Which brings us to the software of their society, the digital and financial rewiring of the population.
Exactly.
Because you cannot export high-value services if your people are operating in an analog, cash-based reality.
You really can't.
Let's look at the digital infrastructure first.
Yeah.
The data tracks fixed broadband subscriptions, and it shows a textbook hockey stick growth curve.
It shoots right up.
Yeah. They went from a dismal 0.8 subscriptions per 100 people in 2004 to over 31.2 per 100 people by 2020.
And that isn't just basic internet access. It represents a massive push for high-speed fiber connectivity directly into homes and businesses across the country.
Right, because if your economic strategy relies on becoming a tech hub and a center for global software development, your workforce cannot be dealing with dial-up speeds or unstable connections.
No, they need fiber.
But the digital hardware is really just the prerequisite. The true social revolution happened in their financial sector. And this is where the data gets incredibly stark.
The banking data is fascinating.
It is. If we look at the 10-year window between 2011 and 2021, the percentage of people over the age of 15 who had an account at a formal financial institution was only 23.5% in 2011.
Less than a quarter of the adult population was banked.
Think about the friction that creates.
Right.
More than 75% of the country was operating entirely outside the formal banking system.
Just cash under the mattress.
Literally.
Like,
But in just one decade, by 2021, that number shot up to 73.7%. They achieved a threefold increase in financial inclusion in just 10 years.
and the mechanism behind that leap is just as fascinating as the wind farms. It wasn't just organic growth, it was driven by aggressive, intentional policy.
I know they passed a massive financial inclusion law around 2014. How did that actually force the issue? Because, you can't just tell people to go open a bank account if they don't trust banks or if the fees are too high.
You have to change the incentive structure, and that's exactly what the 2014 law did. First, the government mandated that all wages, pensions, and social benefits had to be paid electronically into a bank account or an electronic money instrument. You could no longer pay employees with an envelope of cash.
Okay, so that immediately forces the working class into the system. But doesn't that anger people who now have to pay banking fees just to access their own wages?
It would have, absolutely. Which is why the law simultaneously forced financial institutions to offer basic, no-fee accounts to the public. They removed the cost barrier to entry,
That's smart.
but they went a step further to encourage actual usage. The government offered significant VAT reductions, essentially tax discounts, for consumers who made purchases using debit cards or electronic payments instead of cash.
Oh, that's brilliant. They hit them from both sides. They mandated the accounts, made them free, and then gave you a tax break for actually using the card at the grocery store.
It engineered a complete behavioral shift.
But why was this so vital to their macroeconomic strategy? Like, why does a country need its poorest citizens to be banked?
Because a cash-based economy has a hard ceiling on growth. and it creates immense friction. Cash is slow, it's untraceable, it is highly vulnerable to theft, which creates security costs for small businesses.
Right.
But most importantly, cash lacks leverage. When the working class is unbanked, they cannot access formal credit. A street vendor or a domestic worker operating in cash cannot build a credit history.
Because there's no paper trail.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Therefore, they cannot get a small business loan to buy better equipment. They cannot easily engage in e-commerce or accept digital payments from tourists. They are economically ghosted.
They are participating in the economy, but they are trapped in a low-yield loop. They can't build equity.
Yes. By aggressively pushing financial inclusion, the government dragged the entire informal, cash-based economy into the modern digital engine.
Suddenly, everyone has a financial footprint.
Exactly. Suddenly, that street vendor has a digital footprint. They can access microinvestments. They can secure capital. It radically increases the velocity of money within the domestic economy.
And I imagine it helps with taxes, too.
Huge point. It formalizes the economy. When transactions are digital, they can be taxed. And the government desperately needed to widen its tax base to pay for the pensions of that rapidly aging 24.4% of the population we talked about earlier.
Oh, well, it all connects.
It really does.
You cannot run a 21st century digital export economy on a 19th century cash-under-the-mattress domestic reality. They align their social reality with their macroeconomic ambitions.
But there is still a missing piece to the puzzle.
Which is?
Well, we've established that the grid is completely green and immune to oil shocks. The internet is fast, the citizens are banked and transacting digitally, but the fundamental demographic ticking clock hasn't disappeared.
The aging population.
Right. The
Yeah.
workforce is still structurally aging, so who is actually filling all these new connected digital jobs to drive the GDP growth?
Which brings us to a massive, previously underutilized reservoir of human capital.
The female workforce.
Exactly. To keep the economy growing, they had to unleash the potential of the half of their population that historically hadn't been fully integrated into the formal economy. We are talking about the massive influx of women into the workforce.
The ILO data tracks this beautifully. It shows a profound structural shift in the labor market.
The numbers show that for women 15 and older, labor force participation was historically quite low. But over the last few decades, it has steadily and relentlessly climbed, reaching 57.2% by 2023.
It's a massive jump.
It is. If you plot male and female participation side by side, you see the massive historical gap between men and women rapidly shrinking.
Yeah.
The lines are converging.
It is an essential component of the Uruguay model.
I want to explore the why here, though.
Sure.
Is this convergence just the natural result of global cultural evolution? Changing social norms, better education, the general global push for gender equality? Or was this a forced economic necessity? Did the aging population basically demand that the economy restructure itself to absorb women?
It's a powerful synthesis of both. They feed into and accelerate each other.
How so?
Culturally, yes, there is a global trend toward gender equality, but macroeconomically, the conditions in Uruguay created the perfect vacuum for women to enter the workforce en masse, and the government actively built the infrastructure to allow it to happen.
Go back to the infant mortality data for a second. We talked about how fewer children means less time spent entirely dedicated to early childcare.
Exactly. That physical reduction in domestic labor burden frees up a woman's time for formal tertiary education and career advancement. But the government didn't just rely on dropping birth rates.
What else did they do?
They recognized that to get women into high-value jobs, they had to solve the caregiving crisis. So they implemented the Sistema Nacional de Cuidados, the national care system.
What does that entail?
It is a state-sponsored infrastructure designed to provide care for the elderly, the disabled, and young children. By institutionalizing caregiving, the state shifted the burden away from the unpaid labor of women in the home, allowing them to freely enter the formal labor market.
They literally built a social bridge to help women cross over into the formal economy.
Yes. But the nature of the economy was changing too. As Uruguay transitioned away from heavy physical industrial labor or sheer agricultural manpower and moved toward a digital service-based knowledge economy.
The physical barriers to entry evaporated.
Completely. A broadband-connected service economy doesn't care about physical strength or manual endurance. It cares about cognitive skills, digital literacy, and high-level education.
And women were ready for that.
Very much so. Because Uruguayan women are highly educated, often significantly outpacing men in university enrollment and graduation rates, they were perfectly positioned to step into this new economy.
So closing the gender gap wasn't just like a progressive talking point for politicians to use on the campaign trail. It was the essential backup engine for the nation's GDP.
Without that massive influx of highly educated female talent, their economic growth would have hit a brick wall. The demographic dividend ran out, so they activated a gender dividend to replace it.
Okay, I love how all these interconnected systems are clicking into place. You have a shrinking but incredibly efficient population. They are highly educated and living longer.
Right.
They have infinite sovereign green energy. They are digitally connected and fully banked. And they have unleashed women into the workforce to keep the engine running.
But an engine still needs a road to drive on, and for a country of barely 3 million people, that road cannot just be domestic consumption.
Right. You cannot generate massive national wealth in a closed loop of 3 million people just selling things to each other. The domestic market is simply too small to achieve the kind of wealth they have built.
You must look outward.
You must export, and crucially, you must attract foreign capital.
And this is where all of those internal upgrades, the green grid, the banked citizens, the stable institutions, pay off exponentially on the global stage.
Let's look at the wealth generation data. The GNI per capita, the gross national income, adjusted for purchasing power parity.
The growth here is staggering.
It is. Decades ago, it was hovering around a few $1,000s, but starting in the early 2000s, and particularly after 2005, you see this incredibly steep, relentless climb. It breaks $10,000, then $20,000, and today it has surged past $28,000.
That trajectory is the absolute holy grail for developing nations. That upward line is the visual representation of a country successfully escaping the middle income trap.
And their export data reflects this dual-engine economy they've built. Today, their physical goods exports have broken the $10 billion mark, largely driven by highly efficient agricultural products.
But the really telling number is their service exports.
Yes, which consistently clear $5 billion.
That service export number is the payoff of the digital and educational infrastructure. Software development, fintech, high-end logistics, you can't export those things without fiber internet and a banked, educated populace.
But to build those export industries, you need outside money. And the foreign direct investment, the FDI data, shows consistent, reliable inflows of global capital.
They punch way above their weight class here.
They really do. There's a massive spike in 2006 where net inflows hit 7.6% of their entire GDP, and it consistently stays in a healthy, robust range compared to regional averages.
Why does foreign money love Uruguay so much? I mean, there are much larger markets in South America to invest in.
Because capital acts like water seeking the path of least resistance. And above all else, capital craves stability and predictability.
It hates surprises. Exactly. It runs away from volatility, arbitrary regulations, and currency controls. Historically, when foreign investors look at the broader Latin American region, they often see a high degree of macroeconomic risk. They see political volatility, rapid regime changes, sudden currency devaluations, or energy grids that might collapse during a dry season.
It's a high-risk, high-reward environment.
Right. But then those same investors look at Uruguay, and what do they see? They see a population that is 99% literate.
Okay.
They see a workforce that is deeply integrated into the formal banking system, meaning business transactions are transparent and legal.
Check.
They see a political system with deeply entrenched, stable democratic institutions that respect contracts regardless of which party is in power. And crucially, they see an energy grid running on near 100% sovereign green energy.
Which changes the entire calculus for a multinational corporation. If I am an executive at a global tech firm and I want to build a massive, power-hungry data center or a regional headquarters in South America, Uruguay is incredibly attractive. I know exactly what my power bill is going to be 10 years from now because it's pegged to wind and solar, not the volatile global oil market.
Precisely. It fundamentally de-risks the investment. By solving all their internal structural problems, Uruguay transformed itself into a safe harbor for international capital. They became the quiet, reliable, highly functioning back office and tech hub of the region.
They leveraged their institutional trust to create immense economic value.
It's the ultimate payoff for decades of long-term planning. You build a resilient, weatherproof house, and suddenly the whole neighborhood wants to rent a room.
That's a great way to put it. It is a stunning achievement.
Yeah.
But as with any macroeconomic model, we have to look at the friction it creates.
We do.
If we stop the deep dive right here, it sounds like the complete fairy tale. It sounds like they solved economics.
And no one solves economics.
Right. Our sources are comprehensive, and they don't shy away from the darker corners of the data. When you dig into the ILO datasets and the World Bank inflation trackers, there are some stubborn, persistent shadows in the Uruguay model.
The model is highly successful at an aggregate level, but it generates very specific, very painful types of friction for certain segments of the population.
Let's start with the human cost. There is a deeply concerning metric in the ILO data regarding youth disconnection. It tracks the NEETs.
An acronym for youth, not in education, employment, or training.
Exactly. It is a critical indicator of structural inequality.
It is.
The data reveals that the percentage of youth in Uruguay who fall into this NEET category stubbornly hovers between 14 and 19%. Let's average that to about 1 in 6.
That's a lot of kids.
Roughly 1 out of every 6 young people in Uruguay is completely disconnected from this booming green digital system. They aren't in school, they aren't learning a trade, and they don't have a job.
That is a significant chunk of the next generation stranded on the sidelines of their own country's economic miracle.
I really need you to help me understand the mechanics of this, because on paper it doesn't make sense. If a country have practically universal primary education, a booming digital economy, massive financial inclusion, and literally free green energy powering the grid, why are a sixth of their young people completely left out? Why can't they find a place in this system?
It is a brutal irony, but the answer lies in the very nature of the economy they built. Uruguay bypassed the traditional phase of massive, low-skill manufacturing and leaped straight into a high-value, knowledge and service-based economy.
Right, they aren't relying on massive sweatshops or basic assembly lines to employ millions of people.
Exactly. But a knowledge economy is incredibly demanding. It requires high-level digital fluency, advanced secondary and tertiary education, and complex soft skills. The barriers to entry for a good job in software development, international finance, or high-end logistics are incredibly steep.
The floor is simply too high.
Yes. In a traditional industrial economy, a high school dropout can go work on an assembly line, earn a decent wage, and gradually enter the middle class. In a knowledge economy, that assembly line doesn't exist. It has been replaced by a server farm that only employs 5 highly educated engineers to maintain it.
So if a young person, perhaps from a marginalized background, or a lower-income neighborhood where the secondary schools aren't as well funded, drops out or falls through the cracks of the education system, they are in serious trouble.
They are essentially locked out. Because in a highly advanced service economy, the hollowed-out middle of the job market is a real phenomenon. There are very few low-skill safety net jobs that pay a living wage. The fact that the national grid is 100% wind-powered is an amazing macroeconomic achievement, but it does absolutely nothing to help a high school dropout write code or analyze financial data.
The friction of the transition is simply too intense for those who stumble early on. If you don't acquire the specific cognitive tools required by the system, the gap between you and the modern economy becomes an unbridgeable chasm. It creates a deeply entrenched underclass of youth.
It is the structural inequality inherent in rapidly transitioning to a service economy without ensuring absolute equity in educational outcomes. And it remains one of the most pressing challenges for their policymakers today.
And it's not their only headache. If we shift from the social data to the historical macroeconomic data, there is a ghost that haunts their central bank.
Oh, I know what you're talking about.
I'm talking about inflation and price rigidity.
Yes. The eternal struggle of the Uruguayan consumer.
We looked at the long-cycle volatility graph plotting the GDP deflator over the decades. And honestly, it looks like a seismograph during a major earthquake.
It's extremely volatile historically.
In the past, Uruguay suffered brutal bouts of hyperinflation, with the GDP deflator spiking as high as 124%.
Imagine trying to run a business, or just feed your family. When the purchasing power of your currency is getting cut in half in a matter of months, it destroys wealth instantly.
Now, to be fair to their modern technocrats, the data shows that the volatility has compressed significantly over time. They have absolutely tamed that wild beast compared to the past.
They have.
But the reports indicate that price rigidity and the constant underlying pressure of inflation remain persistent daily headaches. Why is inflation so stubborn there even today?
It's the classic structural trap of a small, open economy. Even with a sovereign green grid and stable institutions, they're still highly exposed to global currency fluctuations, particularly the strength of the US dollar. But the real internal driver of their modern inflation is the dynamic of sticky wages.
Break down sticky wages for me. How does that create an inflationary loop?
Well, Uruguay has a highly formalized economy with very strong, legally protected labor unions. Now, this is mechanically a powerful tool for workers' rights. However, it means that wages are negotiated collectively across entire sectors, and they almost always adjust upward based on past inflation.
So if inflation was 8% last year, the unions negotiate an 8% wage hike this year just to break even.
Exactly. But when all businesses across the country suddenly have to pay their workers 8% more, their operating costs surge. To protect their profit margins, those businesses raise the prices of their goods and services by 8%,
Which creates 8% inflation for the current year.
which then guarantees that the unions will negotiate another 8% wage hike next year. It creates an institutionalized wage price spiral. Wages are sticky, they never adjust downward, and because the domestic market is so small and heavily concentrated, there isn't always enough fierce domestic competition to force companies to lower prices.
So the central bank is forced to constantly play tightrope walker. They have to keep interest rates relatively high to cool down demand and keep the whole system from overheating, which in turn makes borrowing money more expensive for everyone else.
It requires constant high-stress maintenance. The Uruguay model is not a machine you can just turn on and walk away from. It demands hyper-vigilant technocratic management.
Right.
But despite these profound challenges with youth disconnection and price rigidity, their baseline reality is undeniably enviable compared to the structural collapses we see in other developing nations facing similar demographic cliffs.
Which brings us to our synthesis. Let's pull all these threads together and summarize exactly what we've learned from decoding this data.
Sounds good.
In the face of an irreversible aging population, a demographic ticking clock with a 24.4% old age dependency ratio that traps so many nations in poverty, Uruguay did not panic.
No, they didn't.
And they didn't try to rely on the old industrial playbook of cheap labor because they didn't have any. Instead, they executed a brilliant asymmetrical strategy. First, they protected their human capital from day one, dropping infant mortality down to 5.5 to match developed world levels, and allowing families to concentrate investments in the next generation. Second, they eliminated their reliance on imported fossil fuels by aggressively transitioning to a diversified, nearly 100% green energy grid.
Building that all-weather portfolio.
Yes, they used wind and biomass to back up their hydro, building a massive macroeconomic moat against global oil shocks.
They modernized the hardware of their nation, but then they modernized the software.
Right, they pushed broadband connectivity everywhere to enable a high-tech export economy. And crucially, they dragged the working class into the formal economy by passing laws that tripled financial account ownership in just 10 years, increasing the velocity of money and expanding the tax base.
And then the workforce.
And finally, to fill the massive void left by the retiring workforce, they built the social infrastructure to allow women to enter the labor pool en masse, keeping the GDP engine roaring and driving their GNI per capita past $28,000.
They leveraged institutional stability to attract global capital, fundamentally transforming a small agricultural nation into a high-value, resilient service economy. And while they still battle the very real structural shadows of youth disconnection and persistent inflation, the architectural resilience of the society they have built is truly profound.
It really is. It completely changes how you think about what a country can actually achieve when its policymakers plan for the next 2 decades instead of just the next election cycle.
It does, and if we connect this all back to the global picture, if a small nation of just 3 million people, without massive oil reserves or a sprawling empire, can completely decouple its economic growth from fossil fuels and build a wealthy, highly stable society while its population rapidly ages.
It raises a big question.
It raises a deeply provocative question for the rest of us. Is the demographic winter this overwhelming fear of aging populations and dropping birth rates that is currently terrifying the political classes of the developed world? Is it actually an unsolvable crisis of population? Or is it simply a crisis of imagination and a failure of policy?
That is a fascinating thought to leave on. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the data. We hope this exploration gives you a new lens to rethink how nations, and perhaps even our own communities, can actually prepare for the future. We'll catch you on the next one.